My parents grew up in North Korea, and at age 5 and 12, just before the Korean War broke, my parents fled south to Seoul, which is where they grew up. Right after the Immigration Act of 1965, which was the law that first allowed folks from East Asia to come to the United States in large numbers, my father came to the States then. And I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We were the second Koreans in the history of the state. I had no understanding of what Korea was. And at age 5, my sister came home from kindergarten one day crying. My parents asked her why, and the other kids had been laughing because she answered the teacher in Korean. And what I've now learned is a very common experience. My parents said, from this day forward, we will only speak English to our children. And I was 3 years old at the time, so I didn't have the access through the language. Mine was a typical story growing up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, not only thinking I was the only person who was gay, but also being Asian, really an alien from outer space. We were hardwired to be perfect, to show only our best sides, to not show any of the dirty laundry, right? To be nice and not make waves. In many ways to blend in and bleach out. So the first time I heard about HIV/AIDS was around 1983. I would read Newsweek or Time. That was the main source of news. And recall seeing the first headlines about this epidemic that folks were talking about. And deep down inside, I knew I was gay. I'm doing everything in my power to avoid that recognition or avoid having others to know. But seeing that blatant association between death and sex, it's quite a welcome to adolescence at age 12. I first learned about the acronym API, which stands for Asians and Pacific Islanders, or Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, when I first got involved with the API community. This happened for me at age 22, and I remember seeing an ad for an organization called Amalgam. It's the Association for Massachusetts Lesbians and Gay Men. Perhaps the coolest acronym in the history of Asian and Pacific Islander LGBT groups. Amalgam was the oldest API LGBTQ organization in North America. It was founded in 1979. I saw this ad in the paper for this group called Amalgam, and I thought, I need to go there. It just was instinctive. And I went to my first meeting, and it was in a conference room. Seeing this room of around 10 or 12 folks who were LGBT and API was a revelation. We live as if we're this tiny minority here, that we're just a sliver of a sliver, but look, Asians outnumber the rest of the world, if you look at it. San Francisco was a nerve center for cultivating and spurring and supporting a whole generation of activists. And for me, I was one of those who really cut my teeth in my early 20s, being passionate and fired up to be involved with the HIV/AIDS response. What's now the San Francisco Community Health Center, one of the antecedents was called GCHIP, the GAPA Community HIV/AIDS Project, had this amazing program called the National Program that provided technical assistance and training for a whole cadre of folks in about 10 cities across the United States. And one of them was Boston. I was there for divinity school, and that was 1993 to 1995. I took 2 years and went to Korea, did the roots thing. And after that, go west. I came out to San Francisco looking for a better life, and I had the opportunity to work in an amazing organization. At the time, it was called the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. It's now called Outright Action International, and had the dream job of working with activists throughout the Asia-Pacific region, working on issues of sexual orientation, gender identity, and HIV/AIDS status and human rights. I think the response to HIV/AIDS among APIs has meant talking about what's not talked about, cutting through stereotypes that certain things didn't exist, like homosexuality, like people who are trans, like sex work, like trafficking. The response to HIV meant breaking those silences and doing community outreach in ways that required the utmost creativity, the utmost in nimbleness, in terms of language diversity, a kind of commitment across the range of that diversity that is really staggering. We're dealing with dozens of languages. We're dealing with communities that might be next to each other. Vietnamese and Hmong communities, for example, that don't speak the same language, that may not relate with one another. I think that one thing perhaps that separates APIs from other ethnic groups, that makes the response to HIV/AIDS a puzzle, I think, is this model minority myth. We're only taught only conditioned to show certain sides of ourselves, talking about sex and sexual relationships, talking about power, talking about advantage and disadvantage, drug use, despair. That's not in the model minority handbook. When I first moved to San Francisco and I walked into what was then the Asian Pacific Islander Wellness Center, there were about 20 people there to do community outreach, to do the work of prevention. And they were able to do that because that was what funding allowed and engaged in. Over time, the funding models to address HIV/AIDS have shifted. So now we realize that if people are on treatment and their viral load is suppressed, that is a form of prevention. And it's terrific that we have the technology that allows folks to be on treatment, to have a virally suppressed load. I long for the world where all people around the world who are at risk for contracting HIV will have access to PrEP, because that's not the case among gay men in almost every country around Asia Pacific. It frightens me that we're seeing rates of HIV climb up. So those playbooks and those handbooks that we saw back in the 90s are desperately needed in cities like Taipei, in cities like Bangkok, in cities like Jakarta, in cities like Singapore. But there's a social element of it that because there's no funding for prevention nowadays, we don't have all of this incredible social capital, which are these people. You know, there were educators who were Vietnamese, Filipino, Chinese, who went out in the community, folks who work with women who are vulnerable, who work with the most vulnerable in the community. I think the ability to have a conversation about safer sex, the ability to have a conversation about condoms, and having these armadas of people that did such incredible work to connect these conversations with communities, we've lost that to some degree. I firmly believe that the response to HIV/AIDS and the movements around those have made our society better. We've had to fight through so many of our own stigmas, demons, cultural notions of who we should be. We've been called the rabble rousers. We've built bonds that otherwise wouldn't have been built. But we've solidified these values of who we are, of empathy, of courage, of integrity. And we've built connections that I think otherwise wouldn't have happened. My world has been changed as a result of that. I think our communities are different. And I hope that the values that have guided the HIV/AIDS response are things that we can continue to use to teach the API community what justice is about.